everybody. Good morning and welcome to this clearly extremely popular lecture on autism. And it's my pleasure to tell you that Dr. Sumaya, who will be giving this lecture, will be introduced by her very distinguished father, our former DVC, Deputy Vice Chancellor, a man who may in his lifetime have analyzed your mucus or your sputum, well known for his wonderful lectures on the cell and biology. So I give you Professor Moore.
Thank you. Thank you, Fionnuala. I thought we were going to do a duet, but we'll do it at some other time. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Sumaya Mal. It's not very often that a father has the privilege of introducing his daughter, but I've had this privilege and I'm very grateful for it. So Sumaya is an epidemiologist with an interest in the epidemiology of brain disorders, which include autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, addiction, and intersections between HIV and neurocognitive impairment, and the relationship between early childhood trauma and health outcomes in adulthood. Now, currently, Sumaya is a senior lecturer in the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the School of Public Health at that other university, which they call the University of Witwatersrand. It's somewhere in a place called Johannesburg, where she teaches, mentors students, and does research. Sumaya has had quite a postgraduate career. She has a BA honors in English literature and then made a diversion to medicine, and has had a master's in public health at UCT Medical School, and then a second master's in science in epidemiology at Columbia University in New York as a Fogarty Fellow. Following on, she obtained a PhD in public health with Professor Leslie Swartz at Stellenbosch University. So she's got more degrees and qualifications than I've had, and she never fails to remind me of that. So prior to joining WITS, she was a postdoctoral research associate in Brain and Behavior Institute at the Department of Psychiatry here at this great institution, UCT. And she was mentored by the world-renowned Dan Stein, who was very sad to see Sumaya go, and we're hoping she comes and joins us again someday. She's also been a lecturer at the School of Public Health at the University of Western Cape and the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare at Stellenbosch University. She's widely published internationally with over 30 publications and has presented her work at local conferences and conferences on the continent, in Zambia, Malawi, Ethiopia, and in Europe and in North and South America. She has won several awards through her career. She's widely read, both in fiction and specialized areas, loves yoga and foreign films and traveling. Now, I've been instructed not to attend this talk, so I'm going to hand this over to Sumaya and leave her in your able care, and I hope you enjoy it. But be kind to my daughter, don't be horrible to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, for the introductions, but also to Fionnuala, who invited me a few months ago to give this talk. I must confess, when we spoke on email, I didn't quite anticipate such a huge turnout, of which only a small percentage are family and friends. But I hope... or people that I know. I hope you're going to enjoy it. What we've tried to do is, it's an update of autism spectrum disorder. So it's a lot of information squeezed into a session. So I thought maybe I'd talk for maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and then we can have a short break and possibly a few questions, but we're going to hold most of the questions until afterwards. And we have to be out of the venue by 12:15. But as I said, it's a lot of information. Don't worry if you don't understand or take in all the concepts right now. We'll try to clarify through questions. We'll also post readings on the readings I've cited on the website and the slides as well. And I'll also give the option of emailing me if you have any questions. So I do have some acknowledgements for the talk. This is Professor Ezra Sasser, who is my mentor at Columbia University in New York, who's a professor of epidemiology at Columbia and also professor of psychiatry. And I work a lot with him on schizophrenia, actually. He's also an autism spectrum disorder world expert, and he very kindly looked through these slides for me before I presented them. So big acknowledgement there. So you heard a little bit about my introduction, but you might wonder, what is an epidemiologist? Now, the root of the word epidemiologist doesn't come from epidermis or skin. It comes from epidemic, which, as you know, means disease. And many epidemiologists work in infectious diseases, so you might have heard the term in relation to the Ebola epidemic, where their skills have been very, very highly regarded and necessary to work in Sierra Leone to look at transmission of the virus. But I work in the field of psychiatric epidemiology, where it's very, very complex because causality is really, really multifactorial of all of these mental illnesses. So of autism spectrum disorder, of schizophrenia, of post-traumatic stress disorder, there are many, many causes. So we study the distribution of diseases in given populations, so who has it and who doesn't. So we refer to that as prevalence. And we also look at risk factors for these diseases. So I'm not using the word causes, I'm using the word risk factor. So it's a lot more tentative. So it's talking about who is at risk of a particular illness. If you have a genetic predisposition or perhaps exposed to an environmental risk factor. So if you could just bear that in mind as we move into the world of autism spectrum disorder. So once we understand causality, so who's at risk and who isn't, we can think about interventions. So treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, all kinds of interventions, but we need to understand causality. And in my work, I engage a lot with epidemiology of psychiatric disorders, so trauma, autistic spectrum disorder. Now I have a new project on addiction, schizophrenia, and the relationship between HIV and mental health. And that's my university, the University of the Witwatersrand, which often gets very bad press in the newspaper because of protests and fires and so on. But when it's not burning, it's a really stimulating and welcoming place. So this is just a diagram of a duck who wants to be an epidemiologist, and it says she's randomizing her siblings in the pond, and a little bit later on in the talk, if you can bear the term randomization in mind, it'll become clearer. So this is what I want to cover today in this autism spectrum disorder update. I want to go through definitions of autism spectrum disorder because those often need clarity. I want to look at the history of autism spectrum disorder, the first known cases. I'm going to focus a little bit on the epidemiology, so the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder, and a little bit on how we would derive measures like that. The theory of mind hypothesis of autism spectrum disorder. So I prescribed a book by Simon Baron-Cohen to you in the course outline called Mind Blindness, which is an essay on theory of mind. I'll explain it more fully. I won't check who's read the prescribed readings and who's not. Try not to treat you like I treat my students. We're going to cover the latest insights into the autistic brain, current interventions, because remember it's a lifelong condition, it's not a cure, and also talk a little bit about mapping autism research on the African continent. So I did mention in the course blurb that autism spectrum disorder has kind of proliferated popular culture. So this was a movie I saw it as a small child. It must have come out in the 90s with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise. And Dustin Hoffman was the protagonist. Many of you will have seen it. And he was an autistic servant in this movie. And it was actually based on a real character called Kim Peek, who was the inspiration for this movie. And he was a man who had an extraordinary memory. He could remember unbelievable facts by heart, books, all kinds of things. So he was the inspiration of the movie. And I think that is really what the perception of autism spectrum disorder often is in the public. So what is it? Okay. Just bear in mind that it's a spectrum, okay? The spectrum means that it's from mild to severe, okay? Okay, some people will have milder symptoms than others. It's a group of complex disorders of brain development, and there are varying degrees of social interaction, verbal and non-verbal communication difficulties, and repetitive behaviors. So by repetitive behaviors, what we mean is that often autistic children in particular will engage in repetitive behavior. So they might do cartwheels, they might spin toys over and over again. They'd have these sort of repetitive interests. And you would have heard, I'm sure if you read about autism in the newspaper or in the popular literature, that the term Asperger's syndrome refers to a higher functioning condition on the autism spectrum. So usually people with Asperger's syndrome are quite verbal. They can often talk very well. Their language is often very sophisticated, but they might have the social interaction deficits that other autistic people have. And they're often very gifted. They're often very, very good at maths, not always, and very, very good at music. And in fact, the application forms for many of the world's top universities, like Cambridge and Oxford, actually ask on the form, usually students are asked to report if they have a disability. They're asked to report if they have Asperger's syndrome. So the onset of autistic spectrum symptoms usually, not always, occurs by the age of 3, but it might also occur a little bit later, so when children are going to school. Because when children are smaller, they don't really have the demands of their social environment. It doesn't affect them as much. Their lives are much easier compared to when they actually go to school. So the symptoms might only become apparent then. But they could also emerge a lot earlier. They could emerge at 6 months or 18 months. Between that period, the children may not be giving eye contact or might show sort of social interaction problems. Approximately 4 males are affected for every female, and this ratio tends to be consistent across studies. But it could be because more males are recruited into studies, because they might be visiting clinics or wherever these studies actually take place. But what's interesting is that as symptoms start to get more severe, so I'm going to talk a little bit in the next slide about comorbid conditions with autism spectrum disorder, so people who have autism spectrum and something else. Now that tends to be equal across males and females. So if we look at intellectual disability in autism, not all autistic people have intellectual disability, but if they do, that seems to be equal across males and females. And there's several questions out there as to why more males are affected than females. Okay, so I've mentioned the word comorbidity. So comorbid condition means to have autism and something else, at the same time. Okay, so common ones include intellectual disability, as I've mentioned, attention deficits, sensory sensitivity. So that means not really enjoying stimuli from the outside world. Some autistic children really hate going into shopping centers because there's so much stimulation, there's so many other people around, there's so much noise, so many outside stimulus. Gastrointestinal problems. When we go into talking about the neuroscience of autism, I'm hopefully going to explain and elaborate a little bit further on gastrointestinal problems. Immune deficits, anxiety and depression, sleep disturbances, and seizures. And I'm hoping the comorbid condition of seizures will also become clearer a bit later. There's also Fragile X syndrome, which is a genetic condition whereby the children and adults who have it also tend to have language and cognitive difficulties. That's quite commonly comorbid with autism. Tuberous sclerosis complex, also a rare genetic condition where the children have tumors. So they have tumors on several organs of the body, possibly in the brain, and could also have cognitive impairment. Timothy syndrome, which is a heart condition, and Savant syndrome. Savant syndrome is often confused with autism because Savants also have very strong language and are often very gifted, but it's not quite the same. And those tend to be quite common in individuals with ASD. So this is a literature review. Now, literature review is what we ask postgraduate students who are doing their master's and their PhD to do when they start looking at their topic, to look at all previous studies in particular timeframes that are done on your particular topic, and then see how your research for your thesis might contribute to the field. So this was a literature review done at the National University of Ireland in Galway, which looked at comorbidity and autism. And this table might be a bit small, but I'll just I'll just read to you the conditions that they found. So they looked at anxiety and avoidant behavior and found that those were higher in autism spectrum children. So you'd have to have a comparison group of typically developing children. You wouldn't be able to make the inference about autism if you don't have that. They looked at comorbid psychopathology, so that means depression, anxiety, that tended to be higher, and also feeding and sleeping difficulties in infants and toddlers with autistic disorders and typically developing children, also finding higher rates in children with autism. So this is just I mentioned that the gastrointestinal problems that children with autism sometimes are at risk of, and this was just a study that was presented at the International Meeting for Autism Research. It's just an illustration of children with gut problems, but as I mentioned, we'll come to that later. Okay, so a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is very difficult, okay? It needs clinical expertise to detect the impairment. So a psychiatrist, a neurologist, a pediatrician who knows. Not all pediatricians are developmental pediatricians, but for example, Red Cross Children's Hospital in Cape Town has a team. Prof. Kirsty Donald is a developmental pediatrician. She's very experienced with autism spectrum. So these are the sorts of people who can make the diagnosis. So for psychiatric disorders, I'm sure many of you would have heard of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. So it tends to evolve as we have more knowledge about mental disorders. So we're now on to version 5. And it's very interesting that in DSM-5, there's a lot of new consideration for autism spectrum disorder. So there's now like an umbrella of social and communication deficit criteria, but what it says is that you don't have to have a language problem if you're autistic, okay? Or you can have a language problem and not have autism spectrum disorder. And something else that's quite interesting is that it looks at, as I mentioned, when children go to school, if their environment starts to become overwhelming, then their autistic symptoms might also start to emerge. Now, what's interesting is that the National Institute of Mental Health in the States, the NIMH, which is a big body of research funding and diagnostic categories and all kinds of things, they have a research domain criteria. Now what they say there is they try to discourage moving away from behavior as a diagnostic feature. So usually with autism spectrum, we look at behavior before we make a diagnosis. So we look at symptoms like social interaction, I've mentioned, and repetitive behaviors and language deficits. Now, the NIMH, RDoc, says, look at the brain. Look at the neurobiological features before we start to say whether people are autistic or not. So when we go through the section on autism and the brain, we'll talk a little bit about some of the neurobiological features and what regions of the brain are affected. Now, there are also tools available for screening for autism spectrum disorder. So that's very much my interest because I want to know how many people have autism in a particular country, community, whatever. So you need a particular tool. So it's usually some sort of questionnaire that is delivered to the parents or the caregivers or maybe teachers asking about all of this information. And it's very complicated. You can see why it could be complicated in different countries, different languages, different cultural groups. But this is the DSM criteria. So the social emotional difficulties, the reciprocating relationships, non-verbal communicative behaviors, developing and maintaining relationships, and then also we've spoken about repetitive behavior, speech, routines, and just a number of others, highly restricted, and so on. And a number of these would need to be present for diagnosis to be made by a clinical expert, as I've mentioned. So one of the books that are prescribed by Steve Silberman for this talk talked a little bit in the beginning about the history of autism and when the first cases were discovered. And that's a very, very, very fascinating area. So in the 1800s, say later 1800s, a young child called Victor, who was about 8 or 9, had been living in the forests in France, and the area was called Aveyron. And he seemed to have been abandoned, and he was found, and he couldn't talk, and he behaved like the animals that had been around him, and he sort of ate raw food, and we urinated against a tree. He behaved like an animal. And a French physician called Jean-Marie Etard, who's in that photograph, decided to take him into his care. And over a number of years, he tried to teach him language, and he tried to teach him how to reintegrate into human society. And what was very surprising and interesting is that he never managed. He never managed to develop spoken language. And if you look at studies of other children who've been abandoned and who've lived with animals, if they integrate into human society, they do tend to learn how to behave like humans. And it was interesting, and it's lately, in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, that developmental psychologists have started to think that maybe Victor might have been autistic. So Silberman describes that in 1943 in Baltimore, in the US, a child psychiatrist called Leo Kanner noticed that 11 of his patients inhabited private worlds, so they weren't social at all. They enjoyed rituals. They were panicked by any change in routine, change in environment, and they were often unable to speak. And he started thinking the Greek word autos, which means self, autonomy, automatic, and so on, and the term autism came from there. And a year later, a psychiatrist in Vienna called Hans Asperger saw 4 young patients who were very disconnected from their families and others. But his patients were different to Kanner's patients. They spoke fluently, very, very fluently. They had ability in mathematics and science, and he fondly named them his little professors. And that's just a picture of Leo Kanner and a picture of Hans Asperger. And one of the other book that I prescribed is The Curious Incidents of the Dog in the Nighttime, which I'm sure many of you have read. It's a wonderful book about a teenager with Asperger's syndrome, and it's actually also a very, very nice play, currently on the West End and Broadway. So let's go to later steps in the field. We're talking sort of the early 1980s now. So Professor Jutta Frith at the University College London, if you read her work, she's done a lot of work on dyslexia in Asperger's syndrome. And she started thinking about Asperger's syndrome and how it's different to other conditions on the autism spectrum. And she said, is it really such a bad thing if people aren't social, or they don't talk, or they don't have friends? Is that really such a bad thing? Is that really a disability? Like, maybe they're just slightly cognitively different. And she wrote this book called Autism Explaining the Enigma, where she discusses some of these differences. And then she got a very brilliant PhD student called Simon Baron-Cohen, who wanted to work further on the theory of mind and these sort of cognitive differences that I've mentioned. So he does have a more famous relative called Sacha Baron-Cohen. Different, but I think also very bright. And today, Professor Simon Baron-Cohen is not only the author of one of your prescribed texts for this course on theory of mind, he's also the director of the Autism Research Center in Cambridge. And he's published very, very widely. So he's tackled some of the same areas. Is Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism necessarily a disability? So with Jutta Frith, as part of Baron-Cohen's PhD and beyond that, they started to work on the theory of mind in autism. So this idea that people with autism have specific difficulties in understanding other people's beliefs and desires, so what other people want. So can you think of a term that actually relates? What is that? What don't you have if you don't understand what other people want? Yes, exactly. So it's empathy. We're going to talk more about the empathy deficit in autism. So this idea that Jutta Frith and Baron-Cohen have, that people with autism also have a weak central coherence. So that means they might be good and strong at processing details, so seeing details around them, but they're not very strong at processing information from lots of different sources. So when we talk about the theory of mind hypothesis, I'll show some experiments that were done with children with autism spectrum disorder, and how they're not very strong at imagination, for example, or imaginative play, or at understanding metaphors, and so on. But what they encouraged, Frith and Baron-Cohen, is a neurocognitive approach to understanding autism. So if we're going to say that autism is not really a disability, or Asperger's syndrome in particular is not really a disability, it's just people who are slightly different, then we need to look at the underlying cognitive causes and also the relationship to the brain. So what part of the brain is actually resulting in behavior like this? So they were actually the pioneers of that. Okay, so moving on to the epidemiology of autism spectrum disorder. Who has it? Who doesn't? How do we get these measures? Now, this particular study refers to the changing epidemiology of autism spectrum disorders. And I think one of the reasons why there's so much interest in a course like this is because newspapers like the New York Times and The Guardian in the UK, they talk about this higher prevalence, that suddenly more people have autism than before. So why might that be? So in the US, in 2012, the Center for Disease Control, which is like a big body, it's like the equivalent of the Department of Health, also known as the CDC, estimated that 1.5% of children aged 8 had autism spectrum disorder. So that's higher than previously thought. Now, it's very, very difficult to do a study like that because you want to make sure that you've estimated properly in your population who has it. So you need you won't be able to knock on everybody's door in a whole country and ask them if they have an autistic child living in their house. It wouldn't be possible. So you need to have a good sample. You need to have active surveillance. You need to review health and education records, so go to schools, go to hospitals, look at all records. I mean, there might be, people are more aware of autism than they were 20 years ago. So there's community awareness. There's a big organization called Autism Speaks, which is a big non-profit international organization. Headquarters are in New York. They do a lot of community awareness where they go and talk to Korean people in New York and people from the African continent, and they give them awareness. There's more effective screening. I mean, I showed you the DSM criteria and how all of those criteria need to be built into screening tools, so questionnaires that are given to parents and caregivers and teachers. There's this new DSM criteria, which, as I illustrated, looks a little bit more inclusive. So those could also be factors that account for a higher prevalence than previously thought. And there's also societal costs. So there are costs to families who need better, higher resources if they have a child with autism spectrum disorder, and also the cost of the comorbid conditions that I illustrated, so getting treatment for those. And this particular article, I think, really illustrates the point of societal costs. This is a study by Baron Cohen, was a senior author, looking at suicidal ideation and suicide plans or attempts in adults with Asperger's syndrome. And it's a cohort. It means people were followed through time, and there were data collected, and then their folders were looked at retrospectively, and they actually found that suicidal ideation and suicide plans were actually quite common. So out of 374 adults, 127, so that's 35%, reported that they had had suicide plans. So that's quite a high number. So what's actually required when you look at epidemiology of autism spectrum disorder, so this idea of prevalence. So not only designing the proper surveillance and proper studies, but also you need to understand universally what is an autism spectrum disorder. So what is going to be your case? And we talked about definitions earlier. And also I mentioned a large sample size, because there's always going to be a danger of underestimating prevalence. There are always people who you won't get, and so you might not know how many people exactly have it. But if you have a strong registry and you have all these numbers eventually, and all these cases eventually entered into a strong database, you might be able to look the following year at incidents, which are new cases. So who's going to get it the following year? So it really depends on building good databases. Okay, this is Professor Daniel Gershwind, who's at the University of California, Los Angeles, and he's a neurologist and a geneticist. And as a medical student in Los Angeles, he was very strong supporter of the anti-apartheid movement, and he never came to South Africa as a result. And 2 years ago, finally his son came on exchange to UCT, and he decided to come and visit him, and he came and gave us a very nice talk on the genetics of autism. So let's just do a quick recap. I apologize, I know there's one geneticist in the audience, Dr. Sharifa Dalvi, my good friend, is here, and I'm hoping that if there are any very complex genetic questions, she'll raise her hand and answer some of them for you. So this is the human cell, okay? We're all made up of cells, and what's important for this particular diagram of the cell and for what I'm going to talk about in relation to autism spectrum disorder is the nucleus and the mitochondria, those parts of the cell. Okay, so DNA, we all talk about DNA, okay? It's the hereditary material in humans present in all cells, okay? Most of the DNA is found in the cell nucleus, but some of it is found in the mitochondria. Now, your information in DNA and my information and your cat's information is stored up as a code of 4 chemical bases: adenine, A, guanine, G, cytosine, C, and thymine, T. So who you are is a sequence of all of these letters, okay? And it's different for everybody. And like the alphabet has words, and the words are derived from the alphabet, who we are is derived from the sequence of these letters. So it might be A, G, C, T, or A, C, G, T. It differs, okay? So the gene, which is a segment of DNA, gives instructions to the cell on how to make a certain protein. Chromosomes, a structure of many genes, are made of strands of DNA, and the DNA is wrapped together to form chromosomes. Each cell has 46 chromosomes. So at conception, you get 23 chromosomes from your mother and 23 from your father. And each gene adds a specific protein to the recipe. Okay? And the proteins are for building our body and for regulating our body. So for example, they build our bones, they keep our hearts beating, they enable our muscles to move, they control digestion. And have you heard, you've probably all heard of the human genome. And mapping the human genome, okay? So a genome is an organism's complete set of DNA, including all of its genes. And each genome contains all the information needed to build and maintain that organism. So in humans, a copy of the entire genome, more than 3 billion DNA base pairs, is contained in all cells that have a nucleus. So how can this message go wrong? So why do some people have just these diseases and disorders? So we often talk about DNA mutation. You would have heard that term, or a variant. It's often in more genetic language, it's referred to as a variant in one of a person's genes, which is a change in that sequence. So those letters that I showed you, it's a change. And the change in the sequence can change the way that the gene works. So it can change the protein, which is needed to build us. So a person can be born with a different number of chromosomes. So who has one extra chromosome? Which disorder? Down syndrome, right. Or somebody can be born with a missing chromosome or a tiny part of a chromosome missing. So in some cases of schizophrenia, there's a chromosome called 22q11, and there's a microdeletion of that chromosome. So it's not even a full deletion, it's a tiny, tiny deletion, which we see in some cases of schizophrenia. So since the 1980s, there's been interest in the genetics of autism spectrum disorder, the genetic etiology, and that's supported by twin studies conducted in Europe and the US, ranging from 50 to 90%. So that means that identical twins who share all of their DNA, one might have autistic spectrum disorder and the other might be somewhere else on the spectrum, or they might have the same sort of symptoms as the other one. And there can be risk among siblings, so not twins, but siblings. And this is something important that's going to become clearer later, but the reported genes among common variants include those implicated in oxytocin, which is a hormone that's very important for social interaction. It's, when is it secreted most commonly? Yeah, during breastfeeding. So when mothers are breastfeeding, it helps them to bond with their baby because they secrete oxytocin. And also serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter. We're going to talk more about neurotransmitters just now. So if you look at this study, it's got lots and lots of authors, and it's got a complicated title. So Insights into Autism Spectrum Disorder, Genomic Architecture and Biology from 71 Risk Loci. So what does loci mean? Comes from the word locus, right, which means place. So why would it be important to find the locus of the gene? So this is a quote from Daniel Gershwind, and he says that it's an amazing discovery to find the locus of the gene. It's the first step in the process of identifying the gene to find its place. And here you can see he refers to it as a needle in a haystack. It's very, very difficult to find. there's amazing technology now to actually have your entire exome sequenced. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. And the particular region is on chromosome 17q, he says, for autism. So exome analysis, we've spoken about the 3 billion nucleotides or letters of the DNA, of which only a small percentage are going to be translated into proteins, which are our functional players in our body. So the exome consists of all the genome's exons, which are the coding portions of genes. And the term exon is from expressed region. It's a Greek term. So Discovery Medical Aid can charge you, I think, $500, and you can go and have your whole exome sequence. So you can go and look at your entire DNA if you want to. Recently, maybe about 2 years ago, there was a debate as to whether or not we should be doing that. So the exome, the protein coding region of the human genome, represents less than 2% of the genetic code, but then contains more than 85% of known disease-related variants. And some cases of autism reflect rare inherited point mutations that previously our study designs couldn't really capture, because there were studies of families and affected family members, and they weren't really being properly captured until exome analysis came into existence. And through exome analysis, we've been able to look at partial loss of functioning in particular genes. There are further complexities in genetic etiology. Okay, it's very heterogeneous. People with autism aren't the same, so studying their genetics is hard. But there are measurable components of the disorder called endophenotypes. And we've spoken about language and social behavior, which we could measure in the unaffected relatives. So if there's one autistic child in a family, we could perhaps look at the siblings. They may have some of the symptoms in a less critical form. So a child with ASD who is perhaps not speaking, their brother or sister might have some form of language delay. And we could use that measure, that information to think about genetics. Okay. It's not only genetics. There's very, very few mental disorders that are only caused by genetics. So there's this issue of gene-environment interactions. So that refers to people who are genetically predisposed to a particular disorder, so autism or schizophrenia or a post-traumatic stress disorder. Sharifa, Dr. Dalby is doing a lot of work on the genetics of PTSD. And there are also environmental events that could trigger something like this. So there's trauma and abuse. There are diet, people who are potentially genetically predisposed to diabetes. They might then also have a bad diet and not exercise. So those are the sorts of environmental stresses, which is why people are often very interested in something like poverty and its effect on health and people's social circumstances, because they know it's not all about genetics. Okay, so all you need for gene-environment interactions, you need a high-risk genotype. Okay, so someone who's at high risk of a disorder, you need an environmental risk factor and a disease of interest. Okay, so examples of environmental risk factors, this is general now, not necessarily in relation to ASD. Could be physical, so radiation, temperature, chemical, okay, biological, like a virus, behavior pattern, late age at first pregnancy, or lack of folate during pregnancy. And the high-risk genotype is broadly defined. So it's quite, you could get X-linked or autosomal. There's lots of high-risk genotypes. There's also the interplay among genes and environment. Okay, so there are mutagens, which are, an example could be radiation. That could affect a structural change in the DNA, which could lead to cancer. Okay, there are also gene-to-gene interactions. Environmental exposures could trigger the expression of a gene that in turn modifies other genes. There are transcription factors, proteins that help turn specific genes on and off by binding to nearby DNA. And then there's this burgeoning new field of epigenetics, which looks at environmental risk factors and how they actually alter the gene expression. So if you can think of our DNA as an instruction book for our lives and for the way we are wired and built, epigenetics, if it was a student studying and they were highlighting specific sequences that are important, and if you can think of that highlighter as a life experience that could change, and somehow it's altering gene activity, It's saying this is not important, this is important. That could result in a particular expression. So for example, in schizophrenia, we look at people who are genetically predisposed to schizophrenia, and we're often very interested to see if they had a childhood traumatic experience or an experience of trauma in adulthood that was before the onset of symptoms of schizophrenia, because we think that might be in some way that traumatic experience is the highlighter that is somehow changing the gene expression. It's a very interesting field. It's very complicated. Prof. Sumaya, the head of psychiatry at Tygerberg Hospital, is doing some amazing work on post-traumatic stress disorder in relation to epigenetics. So you can read her work if you're interested. Okay, so now let's come back to ASD. Environmental factors in ASD have been a very intriguing area of ASD etiology. So we've spoken about genetics, but also the environment. But unfortunately, they were hampered by myths, okay? One of them was that of refrigerator mothers. So there was this guy called Bruno Bettelheim who had a very unfortunate life. He was a child psychologist. He came from Nazi Germany. He was in a concentration camp there, and he had a lot of trauma. And he came to the US, and he got a job in Chicago, and managed to develop this theory that children with autism are the product of mothers who are cold and distant and rejecting. So there's deprivation for the baby to bond properly. That's just a picture of him. And unfortunately, it actually had quite dire consequences. It meant that mothers took a lot of blame and a lot of self-blame and self-doubt. And some children with ASD were taken away from their families. But a number of years later, somebody else called Bernard Rimland, who was a psychologist with, also in the US, with an autistic child, started to think about this theory and sort of pointed in the right, slightly more in the right direction, that there are actually biological causes. Does anyone know who this guy is? Doctor? Okay. So you've all heard about the MMR vaccine controversy. I thought you were going to ask about that, so then I thought I might as well just have a slide. So that you could kind of blame on Dr. Andrew Wakefield. So he was a gastroenterologist in the UK, and he saw some children, 12 children. So remember, we've been talking about bigger sample sizes and how important they are to extrapolate characteristics for a population. 12 is a ridiculous sample size. So he saw 12 children who had gastrointestinal problems, and he then said they've all had the MMR vaccine, and they're showing signs of behavioral disturbance which could be related to ASD. And the issue is that in epidemiological studies, we always look at temporality, so what came first. So it's obvious that the MMR vaccine, which children have when they're babies, would come before autistic symptoms start to emerge. So he created this hype around the MMR vaccine and its relationship with autistic symptoms, and unfortunately a lot of parents believed him and still do. And in the US, for example, there's a lot of problems around people not having their children vaccinated, and then there's still measles, mumps, and rubella. So his study in the Lancet was retracted. That's what the red writing says, when after it had received wide publicity and the vaccination rates had started to drop. And unfortunately, as I've explained, there was a logic because of the temporality of when the vaccine was given. And it's still going on. This was in the New Yorker just this week. So it's still going on. Okay. Now let's talk about environmental risk factors that are a little bit more plausible. So Ezra Sasser, whose photograph I showed you at the beginning, he's part of an autism birth cohort, which means 11,500 mothers in Norway are being followed from pregnancy to birth to when their children are a little bit older. And it's aiming to explore prenatal and postnatal infection, obstetric risk factors, dietary and environmental exposure to potential toxins during pregnancy and postnatal life. And through these detailed questionnaires and biological samples, they're able to collect all this information. And similar, an international collaboration for autism registry, epidemiology, multinational registry, also in Europe, also collecting all this information in a very large sample size. Now, this study is from a cohort like that, where people are followed through time in Norway. And it looks at parental obesity and the risk of ASD. So what's interesting is when they generated their hypothesis, what they thought is that maternal obesity might relate to neurodevelopmental problems, because maternal obesity impacts on the intrauterine environment, and there might be some sort of nutritional issues, something that is plausible that actually might result in autistic spectrums or be related to autistic spectrum disorder in the children. But what they found was a very surprising result. Statistically, they found that fathers who are obese were more likely to have children with ASD. Sometimes that happens in studies. You don't find the same sort of result that you thought you might. Now, I'm going to leave it open, because they don't fully understand the results either. But possibly the results lie in this complex web of epigenetics, and that they warrant further explanation to look at environment. And this one, you all know about folate and how important it is during pregnancy. Neural tube defects in particular, pregnant women are usually told by their obstetricians that they should have folate to try to reduce the possibility of a neural tube defect. This is looking at folate in relation to autism spectrum disorder, where it's also is quite significant. So another environmental risk factor. Okay, so how are we all doing? Does people want a stretch break before we go on to theory of mind? Want to just carry on? Okay, great. So the theory of mind hypothesis in ASD. So remember, that was Jutta Frith and Simon Baron-Cohen in the early 80s, when Baron-Cohen was a PhD student. Now, why I want to revisit it is because I want to link it to the insights into the autistic brain. And you all said earlier that you knew that theory of mind alludes to empathy and having empathic behavior. Okay. So this is a review by Baron-Cohen in the early days, where we've defined theory of mind already, the ability to infer the full range of mental states, beliefs, desires, imagination of oneself and others, and that deficit in theory of mind is a core cognitive feature of autism spectrum disorder. So 4-year-old children who don't have autism spectrum disorder, they can distinguish between appearance and reality. So if you joke around with them and talk about something in the imagination, they would know that you're joking. But that's difficult for children with autism spectrum disorder. So these are just some of the tests of theory of mind that were done in people with autism. So I'm just going to mention some of them. So for example, appearance and reality they found difficult. They found it difficult to understand metaphor, sarcasm, and irony. So there's some stories that they found a little bit difficult, and that's when compared to children who don't have autistic spectrum disorder, because remember, what is key is comparison. So you need to have a good comparison group before you say people with autism are struggling with these theory of mind. So also stories with sort of complex mental states, where there's bluff and double bluff, that sort of thing, they found quite difficult. And also reading expressions, they also found quite difficult, expressions in people's faces. Okay, has anybody heard of Temple Grandin? Okay, so she's a professor in the States. I think probably her field is closest to zoology, but she studies animals a lot, and she's has Asperger's syndrome. And she wrote an autobiography many years ago, which was very nice. But she was also written very eloquently described by the neurologist Oliver Sacks, who was very famous, and he passed away about 2 years, maybe about a year or two ago now. And he saw her as a patient, and he wrote about her in his book, The Anthropologist on Mars. So she had some recognition there. So these are the parts of the brain that are affected by autism. Now, when we say something is affected by autism, or there's some sort of deficit in that region of the brain, it could mean a variety of things. It could mean that the areas are not very symmetrical. Okay, it could mean that the volume is increased. It could mean that the volume is decreased. There's lots of possibilities, that connections are just being not made. So you can see that a number of regions could be affected by autism spectrum disorder. So I'll just take some of them, just describe some of them. So the cerebellum, if I could just use the pointer. The cerebellum, which is located at the back of the brain, and that fine-tunes motor activity, regulates balance, movements, coordinates the muscles used for speaking. The amygdala, for example, this is responsible for emotional responses, including aggression. There's a cerebral cortex, a thin layer of gray matter on the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, and it's responsible for higher mental functions, general movement, perception, and behavior reactions. Okay, so that's just a diagram. So let's just talk a little bit about what actually happens in the brain, and this is going to be just a basic description. So that's a neuron, okay? So a neuron is a cell. Just like we talked earlier about cells in relation to genetics and other parts of the body, the neuron is a cell found in the brain. So it's a specialized nerve cell. The other type of cell found in the brain are called glia. So basically, you get two types of neurons. One is called a presynaptic neuron, and the other is called a postsynaptic neuron. So what neurons do is they take messages to other parts of the body. So the presynaptic neuron will receive the message, and the postsynaptic neuron will the presynaptic will send the message, and the postsynaptic will receive it. So it's a message like breathing or talking or whatever. It's going to become clearer in a second. So that's a diagram of a synapse, okay? And that's a diagram of a neurotransmitter. They're all implicated in this messaging business. Okay, so if you look here, I'm just going to use the pointer again. There's the presynaptic neuron, okay, that needs to get the message across to the postsynaptic neuron. So it could be talk, behavior, social interaction, anything like that. So the way it does that is if you can think of the synapse as the junction or like the train station where the message goes across, and that needs to be assisted by a neurotransmitter. So earlier in the talk, I mentioned that serotonin, which is a type of neurotransmitter, could be affected in autism spectrum disorder. So you can see how the messages could be affected in that particular pathway. And if I just show you, that's just a more sophisticated diagram of the neurotransmitter, which talks about receptors and so on. That's a little bit more complicated. So what's very interesting is that a recent study at Harvard looked at GABA, which is a type of neurotransmitter, and found that the GABA pathway, so if you go back to this pathway here, so the junction, and the neurotransmitter that's supposed to help here to take the message across. So this particular one, GABA, was impaired in autism. So that means that particular pathway is impaired. And what that means practically is that, so you get inhibitory neurotransmission and excitatory neurotransmission. So some neurotransmitters are meant to inhibit something, and some neurotransmitters are meant to encourage something. So GABA could be implicated in processing sensory information. So autistic people I mentioned earlier, they don't like outside stimuli a lot of the time. They find it very difficult. They don't like noise. They don't like seeing lots of different people. They don't like going into public places. And that could be because the GABA, this inhibitory neurotransmitter that's supposed to deal with these outside stimuli and help the brains to process them, is impaired. So that's why they're having that particular symptom. And what's also very interesting is that a lot of autistic people, as I mentioned earlier, have the comorbid seizures, and seizures are excitatory in the reaction in the brain. And GABA, so if GABA is impaired, it's not able to inhibit that kind of activity. And what's also very interesting is the example I mentioned of the gut, and autistic children are being 2.5 times more likely to have gastrointestinal conditions. So in the gut, there's a lot of serotonin for regulation between the brain and the gut, and there's also a lot of nerve cells. So if those are impaired, then that can impair food digestion and digesting complex carbohydrates, and that's why autistic children often have that condition as well. So I'm hoping it's all starting to make sense. Okay, this is the developing human brain. So you can see as an embryo, this connections start to be made. So a little earlier in the diagram that I showed you, we mentioned the synapse. That's like the train station, the junction. So in early childhood, there are a lot of synapses being developed, sometimes 40,000 a minute. And what happens is that as children grow up and become adolescents, the brain has a natural process called synaptic pruning, where it gets rid of some of these synapses naturally, so that the neurological function is more efficient. And what has recently been found in both ASD and schizophrenia as well is that synaptic pruning is not happening. So there might be too many synapses, an oversupply of connections. Okay, so let's move on from theory of mind. So in 2011, Simon Baron-Cohen drew on his work of theory of mind and empathy in autism spectrum, and he posed a new theory of empathy in 2011. I was very lucky. I was in London at the time that he launched his new book about empathy, and it was at the London School of Economics, so I was able to go. I was very privileged. And he suggests an empathy spectrum, just like the autistic spectrum, where some people have some empathy, some people have more, people are on the spectrum, and also a neurocircuitry. So particular regions of the brain are involved in empathy. The reason why it was a little bit controversial is because he poses this theory of human cruelty. So he says people who are cruel, so who are perpetrators of violence. In fact, the example that he cites in his book is about violence in North Uganda conflict, which was really, really extreme violence and beating of rebels and so on. And he talks about this theory of human cruelty, and he says that he thinks the perpetrators don't have this empathy. But then he was asked, are you trying to say that autistic people are cruel? And he said, no, that's not actually what he's trying to say. He just means that they also struggle a lot with empathy, and that they also have underactivity in these regions of the brain, the frontal operculum, the amygdala, and the anterior insula. And that's his book, 0 Degrees of Empathy, which you can buy anywhere. And just some of the diagrams of the brain, where he calls it, he refers to it as the science of evil, but those are just the regions of the brain that are affected. Okay, let's talk about interventions. So autism spectrum disorder, it's a lifelong condition, doesn't have to be a tragedy, but there are several interventions. So much earlier, I showed you a diagram of a duck who randomized her siblings, and she wanted to be an epidemiologist. So randomization is quite important in these interventions. So this particular one with Baron-Cohen and colleagues at the Autism Research Center in Cambridge, teaching children with autism to mind read. Those are particular exercises where one group the groups will be randomized. One group will get the intervention, the other will not. They'll get something else, and statistically they'll be compared later. This is Dr. Katherine Lord, who's been a pioneer of interventions with autism spectrum disorder. She's based at the New York Presbyterian Hospital, the training hospital of Columbia University. I was in New York, and I got very excited when I saw her once at the movies. She was in the audience and watching the same movie as me. And she's got some interesting studies. So she's got longitudinal studies of 2 cohorts. So the children come when they're 2, and they possibly have a diagnosis of autism, and they've been followed through in time. So that means until adolescence, they come back to the clinic maybe every 6 months, every year, follow up as best we can. Obviously, you can't follow up everybody. People die, migrate, but you try to keep your sample. And looking at changes in diagnostic features, academic achievements, as well as family well-being. She's also doing a lot of evidence-based treatment of core deficits through these randomized control trials, parent-implemented treatment for communication, group treatment to look at social skills in verbal school-aged children, and a pilot project creating a communication treatment specifically for low-income families in the US, toddlers who have toddlers and children with autism. So lots of issues. And this one is also one of Baron-Cohen's studies. It's, so we've mentioned oxytocin as the hormone that's important for social bonding. This involves giving people with Asperger's syndrome oxytocin in a nasal spray and looking over time to see if there's social and emotional reciprocity is improved. And it's a nasal spray because this is more likely to act directly on the brain compared to giving it intravenously. All right. So you've heard a lot about Europe and North America and everything that's going on in there and with regard to autism spectrum disorder. But what's happening on the African continent? So this is Professor Petrus de Vries, who's at UCT. He's the head of child and adolescent psychiatry. And he's South African, as you can tell from his name. He studied medicine at Stellenbosch, and then he went to Cambridge, and he remained there for 20 years, became a psychiatrist, worked on autism and tuberous sclerosis, the other rare genetic disorder that I mentioned. And he had an office opposite Simon Baron-Cohen's in Cambridge. Then he decided to come back to South Africa around 2012. I think that's when I first met him. And the first thing that he did was he asked some students to go and do a literature review. So to go and look at PubMed, which is an online medical database, and to look at what was going on in autism in Africa, because he'd worked in England for such a long time, he wasn't sure. And they went and did this literature review, and they found nothing. And they came back to him and said, we found nothing. And he said, are you sure? Go and do the literature review again. So they went and did it again, as people do to their students, and they still found nothing. And the reason is because there has been very little to nothing of work on autism on the African continent. And this is what he's trying very, very hard to build, is to build a whole community of researchers who want to work in autism. So me and him have tried to think about how we would do a prevalence study of autism spectrum disorder in South Africa. It's difficult because of the screening tools are sometimes difficult to use across different languages and culture. And hopefully this next slide is going to change that. So it's going to explain that. So Professor Charles Newton is also a UCT graduate of medicine. He went over to Oxford. I think he's a neurologist, and he works a lot. He was born in Kenya, so he works a lot in Kilifi, which is a rural area in Kenya, on neurodevelopmental issues in children. So not only autism spectrum, but also epilepsy and other issues. And something that he raised that's very interesting is that children with autism spectrum disorder seem to find it difficult to give eye contact. But yet in Kilifi, in Kenya, where he works, it's not polite for a child to look an adult in the eye. So if you give a range of questions about eye contact, none of the children will fare well on that question because none of them give eye contact. So what he's trying to say is that it's very important to have culturally specific tools. So those tools that I showed you from the DSM criteria, they're not always appropriate in a totally different cultural setting. So if you think about South Africa even has 12 official languages. One province like Limpopo has about 3 or 4 different languages. So how would you implement an effective tool that's well translated? So Rosa Hoekstra, who's based at King's College London, she works a lot in Ethiopia, also looking at culturally appropriate ways of trying to screen for autism. And Dr. Angelina Kukuza, a pediatrician in Uganda, she did something quite interesting where she took this screening tool, which is very short, okay, because that's the other thing is people get tired when they have to fill out a long questionnaire. It's 10 questions, and it can be given to a doctor or to a parent, and there's just 10 questions about disability. Can the child walk? Can the child stand? They're quite simple. And she adapted it for use to screen for autism, spectrum disorder, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So you need to sort of think in a cost-effective kind of economic way of how with poorer resources you might be able to do a very, very important work. But so much needs to be done in Africa. Okay. So I'm going to end on a personal note. I had a cousin who was on the autistic spectrum, and he passed away a few months ago. He was a very big part of our lives for 22 years, very, very important to us. His mum and dad are here, and perhaps one of the reasons that we all got so interested in working with sort of vulnerable populations. And my conclusion is really around so this is a quote from Baron-Cohen, who also had a sister, not with autism, but she had a disorder called Sturgis-Weber syndrome, which is a rare disorder. The children often have comorbid seizures and general intellectual disability. And when he was a child, he was actually separated from his sister. She was put into a home, which was a very Victorian idea of disability at the time, to separate the disabled child from their parents and their brothers and sisters. He only regained a relationship with his sister much, much later as an adult. And when she died, he wrote this quite sort of poignant article talking about how you can have a relationship with someone even if they can't talk, and that these sorts of policies can divide disabled children from their families, but they don't always work. And that his life was much richer for having had a disabled sibling. Thank you. Lots of time for questions. That one. Yes, I think folate supplements.
What was the question?
Oh, sorry, I'll repeat it. Okay, so it's Judy. Judy asked about folic acid supplements, because in New Zealand there's a big drive to give folic acid supplements during the prenatal period, and whether I think it's a good idea or not. I do think it's a good idea on the African continent as well.
How about lack of bonding between mother and child at birth? Is that could be a cause?
What do you mean by lack of bonding at birth?
When I had my first child, they talked a lot about bonding. The mother and the child bonding together. That doesn't happen.
I don't know of any specific studies that have been done with bonding at the the sort of the postpartum period in relation to autism spectrum. I think it's more, I mean, this idea of refrigerator mothers was kind of thrown out as a myth, I think, so not the actual, I think it might be like a chicken and egg sort of scenario, so where autistic children find it difficult to bond anyway, and then perhaps it's just not looked at in terms of temporality.
If they're giving oxytocin in a nasal spray, what are they doing about giving GABA and serotonin?
There are not any studies to my knowledge at present around giving, but remember oxytocin is a hormone, so it's something that will bind to the receptor of the cell, whereas GABA and serotonin, those can more likely be targeted, like say in depression, serotonin is also often implicated, depressed people having too much, so then antidepressants target that, so there could be, it's more likely it will be targeted with pharmacotherapy.
Has there been any research into whether more autism is found in lower socioeconomic groups?
That's a very good question, because sure. Okay, so the question is around whether autism is higher in lower socioeconomic groups, so whether or not there's a social determinant. So there are studies, particularly in the US, among low-income communities. Like recently there was a study in a Somali expat community in, I think it was in Michigan, where a lot of these children were showing signs of autistic spectrum. But I think it really relates to particular environmental risk factors that might be prevalent in a particular community that are poorer. So it's not the poverty per se, it's maybe the lack of folate during pregnancy, or being exposed to a toxin, or something along those lines. So it's not poverty that's the particular risk factor.
In the region of treatment, can you comment on stem cell transplant?
I haven't come across any stem cell research in relation to autism.
Could you tell us something about the changes during the life of a person with autism from childhood through adolescence into adulthood?
So that question's about the changes throughout the lifespan of a child with autism, so from baby to adulthood. So actually very recent, just the other day, I saw an article from the San Diego Brain Institute, which looked at the 3 phases of brain development in children with autism spectrum disorder. So they look at not only at the sort of, we've spoken about too many synapses and so on, but also at deterioration. So that's also possible. It's particularly without resources, I think it's possible for children's symptoms to become worse. Or there might be people who are luckier and might have access to therapies and possible medication, and then they might have not deteriorate as much.
Can it work the other way, that you can grow out of it?
Not really. I mean, you might. It's a lifelong condition. There's no cure, but you might be able to manage your symptoms better.
Then another question: when you talk about a spectrum, it implies continuity, and going backwards down the spectrum to 0. So people who don't have ASD have 0, but there must be somewhere between 0 and a sort of hurdle where it becomes recognisably ASD.
Yeah, so there are some.
We've all got a little bit of it, is what I'm saying.
That's what is a popular conception, that we're all slightly on the autistic spectrum. Yes.
It's popular. I mean, is it right?
I think some people are not social, or some people are a little shy, and they might be very good at maths and music, and then sometimes, they're given that diagnosis. But whether or not it's actually given by clinical experts is a different story. I think there was a question somewhere here first. Not for autism spectrum, but Ritalin is more for symptoms of ADHD or ADD. So if there's a comorbid condition, then if the doctor decides to prescribe it, then that could be correct, but not for ASD per se.
I'm interested in the therapies that, you showed us a book which they were using to work with these children. Could you say anything about the therapies that are actually being used?
So there are particular cognitive exercises. I mean, if you email me, or we could post the synopsis or more about the book on the website. There are particular exercises to help with imagination and reading other people's mental states, looking at facial recognition. I'm just losing. Maybe Fionnuala has to come and help with I think there was a question here.
In your head.
Yeah.
Could I just ask people who've got questions that could be written down to write your questions down and then put your hand up, and I'll collect them while Sumaya answers that one.
So the question was about the question was about music and music therapy.
Repeat the question.
Okay, so the question was about music and music therapy in relation to autism spectrum disorder. It was more a comment than a question. Yes. So, there's a relationship between neuroscience and music. And it would be very good to have more information on that. Do you want to?
Is there any study related to Ritalin or any other pharmaceutical substance that could enhance Asperger's syndrome?
You mean enhance?
Or increase, aggravate, or...
I don't know of specific studies around substances that are used that people with Asperger's syndrome use, but generally other mental conditions like schizophrenia, there's a really strong relationship with cannabis and methamphetamine where the symptoms and remission and so on can be affected. So I'm sure there's a literature on substance abuse in relation to Asperger's as well. Have you written down your question?
I haven't, because it's a bit long.
Okay.
So I just want to know, I think we've dealt with a lot of children's diagnoses of ASD, but when it comes to later in life, and if it's been missed, who is the most expert opinion or expert person to diagnose the person? Perhaps in Cape Town, who are the best people to see? And that's question one. And then there's been little discussion about the impact on families and partners who have come across ASD through their life and their marriages, and the impact it has had on the relationship. Is there any possibility that you could address that?
Okay, so your first question is about who's the point of call, and you're talking specifically about Cape Town, and more for adolescents whose diagnosis may have been missed earlier on.
It's more for adults, really, who might have been missed as adolescents and children who have been coping with this and who are really struggling and showing signs of severe depression because of it and really need immediate diagnosis. So who are these people that are the experts in the field and can pinpoint ASD as part of the issue?
So I think that Prof. Petrus de Vries is a good resource. Even though he's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, he does work with older people with autism as well. So he's at UCT and he's quite responsive on email. If you email him, he could refer you to someone in his group, or he would possibly refer you to Autism South Africa or one of his colleagues. And your other question is about relationships. I mean, people with autism spectrum disorder do struggle with social relationships, with marriages, any sorts of relationships, from friendships to marriages to relationships. There have been some studies, but not a very broad literature.
So this question comes from an audience member who is curious why so many people have attended today. Is it a family member? Do you want to ask, is it a family member and get a survey?
No, not really.
No.
I don't want to answer that. Okay, so this question is if I'm familiar with the work of Ron Kaufman and the Sunrise program. I'm not sure, I don't know Ron Kaufman and the Sunrise program. Okay, that's fine.
A question from Dr. Tony. He's in the audience.
Okay, and we can't really understand the handwriting.
Tony, can I just need you because I owe you 10 rand, so I'm so glad to know where you are.
Yes, question related to economic costs. We have an autistic son in our 30s, so I've been involved in the field for a long time. But I've also been involved in setting up of 4 homes that cater for intellectual disability, not specifically autism. Some are, one of them is specifically autism, some have a range of disabilities. And what's come out of this work is a huge economic cost on this, on the family and on society. Do you know of any studies that are done to actually calculate visually and say, what is the cost? This is the cost of doing nothing, and this is the cost of intervention. I also work as an economist, and I believe there's actually a trade-off that if we put more intervention in, it actually have less cost leading to its consequences.
I think you'd have to get like some sort of health economist to model that for you. So they'd look at as you say, the cost of doing nothing versus the cost of intervention, and perhaps with an outcome like employment. There's definitely nothing been done in South Africa, to my knowledge, or on the African continent, but perhaps if you looked, you might find something abroad.
I don't know what that is, PDD.
Yeah. Okay, so this question is about PDD, or pervasive developmental disorder. Yes, that is still a recognized diagnosis, and it's like an umbrella term for several disorders, including autism spectrum disorder. And I don't know what SPD is. I don't understand that acronym. I don't know it. I don't recognize the term as part of the autism spectrum, but maybe perhaps it has a different term that I've.
So it's all this sensory stuff.
Yeah, so that's part of several disorders, including autism spectrum.
So what I understood before, that whether that autism and Asperger's could be a neuroautism.
And the social and emotional, yes. Okay, so this question is about comorbid conditions and how they're more prevalent in people with ASD than others, and if if there are any particular reasons for that. So what that relates to is I tried to illustrate with some particular comorbid conditions. The gastrointestinal problems and the seizures that are more prevalent for particular neuroscientific reasons. The others just could be random.
Have you answered that?
Yeah, I've answered those.
Gosh. Okay, the argument against.
Okay, so this is actually an opinion. It's not really a question. It's about the intervention of ABA, a type of therapy that's to modify behavior and therefore shouldn't be implemented. Also, children may be, sorry, I can't really understand the handwriting.
Become hypervigilant with a child they've got to constantly intervening, they've got a natural behavior. You are changing it, which could be considered cruel.
Yeah.
They're so invested in their behavior, so it could be considered cruel. And also they must become hypervigilant. They've been told what they've got to do.
Yes.
To be acceptable.
Yes.
Which is not what they naturally want.
Yes.
Is that might be too hard for them?
Yeah, so you're tapping into a very critical debate around disabilities, which is that it's a difference that doesn't necessarily have to be corrected. So there are lots of controversies around interventions that change behavior. Recently, about 3 years ago, I saw something where a child with autism spectrum disorder, I think he just screamed a lot and carried on screaming, and it was driving his parents and caregivers insane because he kept screaming. And so they had some sort of operation to correct that so that he would stop screaming. And that was also controversial amongst ethicists. So these sorts of things, they are controversial. But in terms of interventions that could just make lives a little bit easier. So in terms of people with Asperger's syndrome, they know they need to survive, they need to find a job a lot of the time and interact with people. So maybe being part of an intervention around social behavior could actually be beneficial, but it would have to be very evidence-based and very ethical.
Do you mind if I just interrupt you? Sorry, I'm a speech and language therapist who's been working on autism for the last 10 years. And there's a lot of controversy about the different types of treatment that come. And I can see a lot of interest in the faces here. And you're saying there's a survey, or you're already on your survey, but I think there's a lot of people who attend this talk today because you are directly affected by the impact of autism. And I think you all have very individual roads to walk, which have been particularly difficult. And one of the things I think that is so important that you just raised with the MBA is there is no one-size-fits-all treatment plan. So we're so desperately looking for this magic pill that's going to work, like the oxytocin nasal spray, or the serotonin injection, or the pharmacological treatment. But there is no one magic pill. And if you can find as a family that treatment that fits for you and for your child, that is going to benefit the unit, I think you're probably on the best pathway to success. And just the fact that this is such a busy room tells me that South Africa urgently needs more resources. And that's going to stem from things like this. So look at the network around you, because I think you've got a resource here already.
Have you gone through that?
I can't read this one.
Why would we so many here, whether each of us got a family member? I was just very curious.
That's a question that keeps coming up, people wanting to know, and I suggest maybe they discuss it informally amongst themselves afterwards.
Sure, when we get there.
Might not feel comfortable.
I think so. I think that would be best to discuss afterwards.
Okay, that's maybe just an outlandish treatment. Subjected his son to a series of shaman rituals.
Oh, okay.
Could you comment?
Okay. Okay, there's a question that so This was a question about someone on the African continent who's
mentioned in a book,
Okay.
who wrote a book.
I had a book by a father who subjected his son to a series of rituals in Africa, Australia, and Europe, and could I comment? So presumably this was a child with ASD who was then subjected to a series of rituals. You know, it happens in several cultural communities where children are showing, it doesn't have to be ASD, it could be something else, some epilepsy, or something where there's some sort of noticeable symptom that's different to what others, and then there often are rituals and visits to traditional healers. I think it depends very much on the region in South Africa where this would happen, like perhaps more rural compared to urban. I don't have a particular opinion. I think people have a coping strategy. It can also be, like in Ethiopia, it's very hard to get to health care, so people with schizophrenia often visit a traditional healer before they can get to the hospital, which is a number of hours away. I do advocate biomedical treatment because I think that and therapies that I think that could improve the quality of life of people with ASD, but I don't have a particular opinion about rituals.
This one wants to know if improvements in technology are playing a role in the interventions.
Yes, I think that a lot of people with ASD enjoy iPads and iPhones if it's affordable, and there are ways of, there are exercises and ways of communicating. I read an article recently about people with Asperger's syndrome who struggle to go to the kind of job where you'd be in an office and with other people. So there are sometimes technologies that can help for working from home, and using Skype and FaceTime and that sort of thing should be a little bit easier. And yes, definitely the other part of the question is about data collection in studies. Definitely in studies we try to use technology. So even if it's facial affect recognition or around symptoms and quality of life, it could definitely be done with an iPad or a smartphone.
And this one asks whether physical trauma can cause autism.
Okay, so the question about trauma is an interesting one because trauma is a risk factor for so many mental illnesses, or we think it is, for schizophrenia, for bipolar, definitely for post-traumatic stress disorder. I haven't seen any studies that have looked at trauma in relation to autism, particularly this question is about physical, like a head trauma, as an example, concussion, but I have seen in relation to some other mental disorders.
Here's some very medical questions. Is that cleavage as in attachment or cleavage as in breaking apart?
Breaking apart.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how the oxytocin spray works. I know that it's administered through a nasal spray, and that was thought to be superior compared to intravenously because of better route to the brain. But we can talk about that later.
Yes.
And that's my uncle.
They're always the ones with the curved balls.
And gastrointestinal symptoms and any connection with the microbiome, yes, absolutely. Well, I know that there's a strong interest in the gut and the gut-brain axis. So, and also because the gut has such a lot of nerve cells and serotonin, and also it's around absorption of particular nutrients, and also processing of carbohydrates and proteins, particularly complex carbohydrates. I could give you those articles as well.
So then, are there any particular bacteria that are recommended in the articles?
No, not that I've seen.
Did you answer the question about low tone and autism spectrum?
I know that there's a relationship between low tone and autism. Amanda can possibly also comment in it from her work as a speech therapist. It's particularly around because there's not accelerated language development in the earlier years. So there's a possibility.
Occupational therapist in the crowd, it might be a bit of this from a speech and language, from a communication side, low tone. I've seen, I think tone and communication and Asperger's, they're quite, as far as I've seen, have been quite unrelated. It's not I do speak under correction.
Two questions about helping a child. What can I do to help a child to sit still as a remedy?
Okay. This is about helping a child to sit still as a remedy, and also it's asked if it's related to GABA, the neurotransmitter, and also sensory overload. I think if the Red Cross group, maybe Prof. Kirsty Donald, was contacted, so she's a pediatrician, a developmental pediatrician, she could recommend an occupational therapist who could help with that.
And the increase since 1945, do you think there has been, or is that just reporting?
It's a combination of factors. So there's a higher prevalence than was previously thought. And as I mentioned, it's possibly due to more awareness, to better screening, to broader DSM criteria. There's lots of explanations.
There are two similar questions asking about support groups and activities, programs, and websites.
Okay. I think that Autism South Africa is a good resource for support groups. If you just look on the web at Autism South Africa, they can probably refer you to someone.
Anything to say about?
Sure.
There's quite a lot of Facebook support pages, and there's one really good one that was written by the whole admin team, are all adult Asperger's. It's called Brian's Advocacy.
Excuse me. Brian's Advocacy.
There are speech therapists specializing in autism.
Use those as well.
It's that interventionist as well. For the Autism South Africa website, it's got some wonderful documents on there about your legal rights with a child with autism too, particularly when things come to education in South Africa. So things like Watch Ever 6 and how to encourage getting your children the help that they need legally and being able to enforce that. Because I know there's still a lot of resistance when you have to teach the childbearing age or transitioning from childhood into adulthood. There's a lot of help and support on that website, and that can also help them improve local groups.
Okay, that's...
Autism South Africa, ASA.
There's two.
why don't I can just email them back. Yeah, that's fine.
Life expectancy.
So there is a literature, this question is about life expectancy. This one. So this question is about life expectancy in people with ASD. So there is a literature on mortality, not only in relation to people with autism spectrum disorder, but about mental illness in general. So like recently in Gauteng, there were those mental patients who died of unexpected causes. There's different possibilities. So there could be a comorbid autoimmune condition or an untreated epilepsy, or there's a whole range of conditions. But if I'm emailed, I could share some articles about life expectancy and mortality in people with ASD. Yes. Sorry, can you just repeat the second part?
Was it about hereditary?
What do you mean by hereditary influences? So there is a strong genetic component. So I would think that if both parents have it, Dr. Dalvi is somewhere in the audience. Maybe she can, I'm sorry to pick on you, but maybe she can.
Come down and speak into the mic.
You can speak into the mic if you want.
Just come and put your arm around your friend.
To speak into the mic.
Thanks. So with any psychiatric disorder...
No, she just stands next to you. This is the battery.
Okay, so with any psychiatric disorder, there's very complex heritability patterns. So I mostly work on bipolar disorder, and that has a heritability of up to 80%. But of course, it's different for different people and different families. So it's very difficult to say for a particular family, if both parents have it, what are the chances that the child will also get autism. The thing is, we've been studying this genetically for a while, and we haven't come up with any conclusive, definitive loci that will predispose you to getting a psychiatric disorder. So, so for example as well, it's many genetic loci together interacting with the environment. So there's nothing that we can measure at this moment to say, well, you've gotten a 100% chance of getting autism. So the answer is complex, because the fact is we really don't know that much genetically.
Thanks. I think that, do you want to take more questions? Would you?
Maybe
we've got one there and another one.
Maybe we have a few last ones. So that's an interesting question, because there are often overlapping symptoms between schizophrenia and autism. So there might also be an empathy circuitry problem in relation to schizophrenia. So they're not linked per se, but there just could be overlapping symptoms.
And another, yes?
Can I just ask something? In connection with, if you have two parents with ASD and they have a child with ASD, well, they don't know that he's ASD, is it possible to mimic their behaviour into the child's behaviour?
You mean,
If both parents have ASD or some symptoms of ASD, they have a child, and he sees, the child sees their behaviour, and then copies it and mimics, and it becomes part of his developmental behaviour.
yeah, so there is some sort of literature that suggests, I'm not going to say it's evidence, but suggests that even when children go to an autistic school, they might copy the behavior of some of the other children. And then that it's slightly more pathological behavior because it's not what children in mainstream school do. So it is possible.
And next to the question over the mouth.
There are different comorbid conditions associated with autism. So there are seizures, as I've explained. There's Timothy syndrome, which is a heart condition. It's different from family to family and individual to individual. It's very heterogeneous. Yes, we're going to put it online, and I'm also going to give the citations that I've used.
I think when we end there, and then I'll just let people that can come up and speak to you, because it seems very personal. Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to thank Sumaya and promise you that I'm going to invite her back next year to speak about schizophrenia. She says she feels more comfortable with schizophrenia, and she seems very comfortable with autism. And invite those of you who have more questions to come forward and speak to Sumaya. We have this room until 12.
Thanks, Vanilla.